Okay, we are a minute past 4, or at least here where I am. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Martin Franke. It's good to have you here at the live webinar with guidance through the digital decade. The EU Digital Decade is a strategic initiative launched by the European Union to achieve a set of digital transformation goals by 2030. Um, It aims to strengthen Europe's digital sovereignty and enhance its digital infrastructure, skills, and innovation capabilities. Initiated by this, there are several developments that are of importance to any industry or any individual, and therefore also for the fire safety and security industries. In particular, the Data Act and the AI Act are important, and these are the topics of our webinar today. As speakers, I'm happy and proud to have with us Brian Cunningham. He's Vice Chair of the European Services, Euralarm Services Section. Welcome, Brian. And Victoria Ferreira Lopez, until recently Vice Chair of the Services Section, but since the beginning of this month, Chair of the Advocacy Committee. That's it so far from my side. Before we start with the webinar, I'd like to introduce you to Paul van der Zenden. He is our General Director, and he will do a brief introduction of our organization. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin. On behalf of the Euralarm board and the professional team, welcome on this webinar guiding you through the digital decade. Next slide, please, Martin. Euralarm is a leading industry association representing the fire safety and security industries in Europe. We offer advice and expertise to the industry, the market, policymakers, and standardization bodies. The fire extinguishing, the fire detection, the security and services industries have very distinguished solutions, regulations, and legislations, and that's also why our association is divided into 4 sections. The first section focuses on automatic fire extinguishing using various technologies but excluding sprinklers. The second section, our fire section, primarily deals with the electronic fire systems, including sensors, panels, and evacuation systems. Third section is the service section, which focuses on maintenance and alarm reporting services. Finally, our security section addresses intrusion protection, hold-up systems, access control, and video surveillance. Next one, please. Shaping the fire and security industry as a leader in innovation, we help European companies and associations to capitalize on European market opportunities. We do that by supporting the European market and maintaining a high level of standards. We address the challenges of digitization and assure a sustainable supply of innovations. We're committed to developing a qualified and well-trained workforce, as well for design, installation, as maintaining our systems. Our efforts contribute also to a greener Europe, presenting growth opportunities and enhancing industry performance through a diverse workforce. Webinars are one of the tools we use to inform stakeholders on important developments. This webinar is focused around 2 recent European acts, around data and artificial intelligence. I wish you a good webinar, and I would like to hand over with that to Brian Cunningham.
Thank you very much, Paul. Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to our latest webinar. So the first half of this webinar, we're going to focus on the EU Data Act and sort of walk you through some of what the Data Act entails, what its potential impact will be, primarily for manufacturers and service providers, what the potential implications of that are, and then we'll wrap this first section up with a quick look at some of the work we're doing on preparing guidance around the Data Act. So next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, so just the overview, the quick overview on the EU Data Act itself, then drilling down a little further into the provisions and the scope. There's sort of four main areas that the Data Act covers. Then we'll walk through some of the opportunities and certainly some of the challenges that are involved, the currently hot topics at the moment. And then finally, we'll discuss the practical guidance that Euralarm is working on in conjunction with Orgalim. Okay, next slide, please, Martin. Thank you. Okay, so in terms of what the Data Act is, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's part of the European Commission's overall data strategy. Now, the first iteration of this came into force in around January, I think maybe January 12th, 2024. So it's relatively hot off the press. And as you could imagine, there is still a general lack of awareness, not because of lack of engagement, but simply because they're within the EU arena. There is such a great deal of work going on in terms of standards, new standards, and revisions of existing standards. So as Euralarm, and obviously with our partner organizations, it's really up to us to help sort of drive that awareness, and as we'll come on to later, begin to offer practical guidance and support around it. Now, in terms of the Act itself, its aim is to really make data available for use, and sort of sets out rules around who can access that data, and the purpose around why they should, or the rationale behind why that data should be made available. And the EU's rationale behind that is to try and sort of drive economic output within the various sectors within the EU. I guess sort of, very briefly, what they're hoping is that by unlocking these sort of vast, deep wells of data that are, gate kept, if you like, behind sort of industry gates and barriers and organizations, by freeing some of that up, by making it available, it will drive innovation. Innovation then will hopefully drive growth, which will then, as I'm sure you're aware, will then drive prosperity within the EU, and then that would hopefully begin to seep out in terms of investment and then trade export. That is the goal, and certainly I think we feel it's an achievable goal. So the Act aims to set out some interoperability standards around how that data can be accessed, how it's transferred, and how it's used. In an ideal world, this sounds absolutely fantastic. In an ideal world, there won't be any barriers. There would be free flow of data, and there would be no bad actors. There would be no misuse. There would be no sort of loss of IP. However, we live in the real world, and these are concerns that have certainly been raised by manufacturers and service providers. And the legislation of the Data Act attempts to factor that in. So we'll be covering some of this in the opportunities and challenges in the coming slides. So that's a quick overview of what the Data Act is and what it attempts to do. Next slide, please. Okay, so drilling down a little deeper, the Act itself is split into four main areas or provisions. So the first of which is data sharing, trying to sort of get data that's held behind these sort of gatekeepers out into the maybe not so much the wider public, but shared amongst organizations and research bodies that will be able to drive innovation. Now, the aim of the Act is to, whilst enabling data sharing, is to do so in a way that's reasonable and fair, so that it's not putting manufacturers and service providers who have already poured money into innovation to build products and services, and they have built up rich data seams based on that initial investment. So the Data Act aims to try and make the use of that data that that they have made possible reasonable and fair, and to also cover the or address the issue of compensation, which I'll touch on very briefly now, and I'll go into a little bit of more detail later on. What they mean by compensation is that if I, for example, as a service provider or a research body, for example, or a customer rights advocacy body approaches, let's call it Amazon for want of a better example, requesting access to data that's been collected as part of Amazon's product offering, say around AWS and the use of AWS within the life safety systems arena. If we make a request to Amazon, the Act makes provision for Amazon where it is reasonable to request compensation from me or my body for the costs incurred in preparing that data and making it available to me, my research body, or my user base advocacy organization. Now, again, the devil is in the detail with that. It throws up some interesting questions around what is reasonable compensation, but it also seeks to put in some sensible barriers that protect against, if you like, sort of spurious requests for data, which would, tie up precious manpower on the behalf of manufacturers and service providers. So we'll dip into that in greater detail in the coming slides. Second provision is around data access. So giving people access to the data, giving them access to the data, or giving other manufacturers, research bodies, advocacy groups access to that data in a manner in which they can actually do something meaningful with it. Of course, that begins to touch back on compensation. I think we've got a little... Okay, yeah. That wasn't my hairdryer, I promise. And then thirdly, moving on to data protection. And of course, there's a little bit of an overlap between GDPR and data sharing. Again, we'll dive a little deeper into that as we work through the slides, but there is provision for protection of data. I touched on things like intellectual property, know-how, and how that's protected as part of the Act. And then lastly, what some of the barriers to sharing may be. Again, that's covered within the Act itself. But broad brushstrokes, those are the four main provisions that are captured within the current version of the Data Act. Okay, so let's move on. Next slide, please. Okay, so I sort of mentioned this in the previous slides. So in terms of who the legislation or who the Act affects, it affects manufacturers, service providers, really so that individuals and organizations are able to reuse data that has been created through their use of products and services that manufacturers and service providers have created. So in this instance, this is a little dry, I like to think of it as dry as burnt toast. But to give sort of a slightly clearer example, say, for example, we have a large multinational European company that manufactures not only fire alarm systems, which is sort of my area of interest and expertise. And that manufacturer provides a cloud-based platform which allows end users to connect together via this cloud offering all of their fire safety equipment right across multiple sites in Europe. Now, if we take an example of an end user, say a large hospital or a large multinational corporation, say a supermarket chain, it would be reasonable for that supermarket chain as the service user to then approach the manufacturer stroke service provider in this case and request access to the data that's being generated and collected through this cloud connection portal. They could reasonably argue that they have invested in the fire protection infrastructure, the data that's being collected in real time from their fire safety networks, detectors, what have you, being pulled and pulled from the fire detection systems and then brought back up into the cloud, which again they are paying for. They can reasonably argue that this is data that's their data that's being generated through products and services, and they would like to use that data for analysis, maybe some in-house research, and last but not least, possibly to prove that their systems are being well maintained, serviced, and tested. So that's a very reasonable sort of scenario where an end user may approach a data holder and request their data. Now, the Act is intended to encourage this data sharing. Now, that example that I just gave is probably, in my personal opinion, probably 9 times out of 10, it would be the end user that will be approaching the manufacturer or service provider. We may well see in the future a situation where we have manufacturers or service providers who have decided for strategic purposes that they're going to make this data available to their clients and push that as part of their overall offering. Time will tell, but I think for the foreseeable future, we'll see the data requests coming from the end users, and then manufacturers, service providers, then having to engage and provide that data. This particular focus, as I'm sure you won't be surprised, on connected products. I mean, everything is now connected, and increasingly more so. And certainly that example that I just gave of fire alarm systems, data being pulled into central points in sort of cloud-based systems, software as a service, compliance, and infrastructure as a service is just one example of a great many. So that's just a quick overview of who that would affect. As you can imagine, on the pure IT side of things, it will affect manufacturers who produce things like switches, Wi-Fi routers, LoRaWAN routers, etc., all the sort of stuff that we typically think of in terms of IT infrastructure. But then with our Euralarm hat, especially with our Euralarm hat on, we then sort of realize, well, okay, this now affects, because we're increasingly connecting things together. We're increasingly sort of leveraging IoT and parts of sort of the edge environment of our infrastructure and data collection around that. So we're finding that our security systems, in fact, security has been quite a bit further advanced than certainly fire. But all of these systems, as they become even more interconnected, will fall naturally within the remit of the Data Act. So this is not going away, and it's certainly part of Euralarm's remit to help our members get to speed with this and be prepared for it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of guidance from Euralarm, so the work on the Data Act has been ongoing now for a couple of years, and as I mentioned before at the start of these slides, the Act came into force January of this year. So there's still quite of work going on in terms of trying to understand what the Act is and what its impact is. Euralarm have been working with Orgalim in putting together some guidance specifically around fire safety and the security industry, or the sort of 4 main sections, with the exception of sprinklers, that Euralarm covers. Now, this guidance aims to provide practical advice on how to not only interpret the Act, but how to implement it, so that when, as a manufacturer or a service provider, you are inevitably approached by one or more of your clients, that you will actually have policies in place and procedures in place that will allow you to determine whether indeed the request is reasonable, because in some cases it may not be reasonable, and if it is reasonable, then what the impact is on your organization, how much manpower would this facilitating this request actually entail. And also part and parcel of that is helping to organizations to understand where the boundaries are in terms of ensuring that they can protect their IP, protecting end user privacy, and also protecting that sort of specialist know-how. So the Data Act doesn't give the end user, if you like, the right to open-endedly request data from the manufacturers and service providers. There are controls around that. So if the data request impinges upon IP, then the manufacturer is within the law to refuse that. Now, that may be queried, that may be challenged. However, if the manufacturer has a robust rebuttal, then that can be dealt with in fairly short order. And then lastly, the guidance that is currently been working on focuses on some of the unique challenges that face our particular industry around life safety as well. In terms of the timeline around the guidance, we'll come on to that towards the end of the slide. It still is very much a work in progress, and we'll be aiming to release some early drafts in the coming months. But as I say, we'll cover that in the closing slides. Okay, next slide, please. So in terms of the concerns and what the potential impacts might be, as I've touched on before, there's a great deal of concern about potential loss of intellectual property. So the Act is very clear that where intellectual property is impinged, the manufacturer and service provider is legally not obligated to disclose any of that. There may be situations where there is a challenge to that, but it would be down to the data holder and the manufacturer to rebut that. But there is provision within the Act to protect the manufacturer and the service provider. Also protected is reduction or negation of an impact of competitive edge. So in terms of intellectual property, there's some intellectual property that is what we would call soft intellectual property, where, strictly speaking, it is difficult to obtain a patent. However, the IP does contain know-how or forms know-how that is unique and bespoke to a manufacturer. They have invested time and money into building up that know-how, and releasing that know-how would have an impact on competitive edge. And again, it's well within the manufacturer and service provider's remit to deny access to any information that would adversely affect that competitive edge. And again, if the manufacturer et al. Can reasonably demonstrate that there would be an impact to their competitive edge, then any challenge that might be sent their way can be rebutted. So again, the Act is very clear around that. This is about protecting the investment that's already been made, whilst helping to ensure that if data can be shared for the purposes of innovation and driving growth and revenue, then it's a win-win for all involved. Of course, with many things in life, there is the law of unintended or unforeseen consequences. Where a manufacturer or service provider believes or suspects that the release of data may aid criminal activity or may help or may make it possible to discriminate amongst groups, they can refuse or decline to release that data. Again, that in itself may be subject to a challenge. again, the quite a bit of work has been done around the Act to identify scenarios and examples where that clear-cut cases of where that would be involved. So in terms of discriminatory information, this would be, for example, releasing personal details which impinges upon or overlaps with GDPR. So the release of data to an end user that would give them access to sensitive personal information about a customer's end user, the person on the street, may be the access may be denied or restricted on that basis. Just before we move on that subject, it is possible for the data holder to anonymize that data. Now, if the data can be anonymized without affecting or without impacting the usefulness of the data, then the Act clearly states or lays out that the manufacturer and service providers should do so. Then moving on, more sort of infrastructure or service related, where you have, I just simply call them denial of service attacks, but really this is where you've got spurious requests for data. So either by volume or small number of requests that will in of themselves generate or necessitate a huge amount of work in terms of processing the data and making it fit for distribution. Again, if the manufacturer and service provider feels that the request is beyond their capability or would cost too much, even if they have issued a request for compensation to the requester, they do have grounds for refusal. And again, it may be subject to query, which sort of touches on the cost of the compliance. Some of this data that's collected is difficult to cleanse, difficult to format, and once you've done that, what do you then do with it? In terms of there's an element of support around that. So when you've gone through the process of data cleansing, stripping out data that is not relevant to the request that's been received, once you've reformatted it and packaged it in a manner that can be digestible by the person or organization requesting the data, then you have the issue of, well, how is that supported? How is it stored? How long do you store it for? There's legislation in the UK which states that digital material is stored for 6 years. Now, that is all well and good when the data that you're requesting maybe runs into the gigabytes or terabytes. If you consider a large telecoms provider or a large manufacturer of fire alarm systems, high-end routers, firewalls, the data in question may run into significantly more than terabytes per request. So the onus then becomes on the manufacturer, the service provider, to not only make available that data, cleansing it, etc., but then storing all of the processed data for future use should it be needed. And again, that comes back to the question of compensation. What is fair? What is reasonable? Will the request impact the service provider and manufacturer to an extent where they have 3 or 4 people for several months engaged on this work? These are all things that the Act does take into consideration. In terms of concerns and impact, we touched on what is deemed to be fair use regarding innovation. My personal take on that is that although the Act does set out guidance around this and provides examples, I think there will be, over the next couple of years, I think there will genuinely be instances where that will be tested. So we'll wait to see how that plays out, and the results of those tests and the feedback from those, I think will feed into further revisions of the Data Act. Oh, sorry, Martin, we've lost a slide. Excellent, thank you. No, go. Yeah, there we are. Thanks. And then sort of lastly, exposure of key infrastructure data. So I've been involved in the past with remote services, EN 50710. My family's tired of me talking about it. So you can imagine service providers such as ARCs, with large-scale installations, receiving a request from end user groups or indeed healthcare organizations that they provide services for, requesting data about performance data, response times. So that in and of itself is a reasonable request. What may not be reasonable is where the end user is asking for information about the actual infrastructure itself. So the design of the remote services, some of the more interesting and deeply technical information around provision of cybersecurity for the remote services, that could be viewed as detrimental to the infrastructure that the ARC is providing, as an example. But again, this is where the Data Act is very clear around the service provider's ability to outright reject a request or to limit the scope of the request through concerns around infrastructure. You can imagine that certain criminal activity would, certain criminal elements would be very interested in understanding in greater detail what the cybersecurity infrastructure is like for major ARC providers across the EU. Okay, so those are just some of the concerns and impacts that are addressed as part of the Data Act, and certainly some of the concerns and impacts that we've been considering and working through as part of the working group at Orgalim and Euralarm. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to drill down a little bit deeper into the four main areas, or so the four main provisions, and then we'll come back up to the surface and finish off with looking at the timeline for the release of the Euralarm and Orgalim guidance. So in terms of data sharing and also reuse, which is covered under data sharing, this is, as I mentioned before, this is where the users can have access to the data that's created through their use of products and services. And the terms and conditions set out in the Act sort of lay out what is considered to be fair and what's considered to be controlled use as well. We, as part of our guidance, we will be advocating that that manufacturers and service providers go back and that revisit their terms and conditions, their service terms and conditions, with the Data Act in mind, and make it very clear to their end users, their clients, what as a manufacturer they deem to be fair and controlled use. So it sets it out very clearly for clients, really from first principles. In terms of sharing requests, well, we sort of touched on this throughout the slides, but those requests can come from individual members of the public. They can come from the end users of the services and products themselves, which is really what we're focused on, and certainly what the Data Act, the main focus of the Data Act is on. Certainly research bodies to try and drive innovation. Compliance and regulatory bodies, especially the public sector, and then in certain cases, other service providers and manufacturers, again, to try and stimulate and drive innovation. And certainly that last bullet point is where it's reasonable to be concerned about loss of IP or technical know-how. And we touched on compensation a little earlier. So this is where if a manufacturer and service provider deems that the request for data is fair and that they can reasonably meet that request, then they are, as part of the Act, they have the right to request compensation for the work that they will have to do, the time and effort that they need to put into preparing the data, whether that's formatting the data, providing specific tools to allow the requestee to parse through the data and do something meaningful with it, and certainly to anonymize the data before shipping, and stripping out anything that may be sensitive. And indeed, the compensation needs to be reasonable. If it's not deemed to be reasonable, certainly by the service provider or manufacturer, they can cite that as a reason why they don't feel it's possible to comply with the request. But there certainly is provision for compensation. So this is not so the Data Act has not set up a, if you like, a Wild West scenario where anybody who has bought a router or a small wireless fire detection system to start making spurious and highly expensive requests for data. And just sort of touching on that before we are going a little deeper on that before we move on, the data that they're requesting has to be reasonable. So it's data that either is this data that is gathered by their use of the software or the products and services. Okay, next slide, please. So in terms of data access around, specifically around connected products and services, the data itself must be accessible. So a request cannot be submitted. Well, sorry, a request can be submitted asking for data that is not gathered directly through the normal operations of the product or the service that's being provided. If the data can be inferred, it is not the responsibility of the manufacturer or the service provider to do that. So the data must already be being collected as part of the end user's use of those products and services. So the data must be accessible. It must already be being collected. The data itself must be secure. It must be accurate as well. So that really is both security and fidelity and accuracy of the data is very much the responsibility of the manufacturer and the service provider. Setting compensation to one side, it should be free of charge to the users. So if this data is already there, it's already in a format that is easily digestible, then it should be free of use to the end user, the requestee. In terms of the data itself, I mean, there's a variety of different ways that it can be structured, but certainly some of the work we've been doing in terms of guidance is to recommend that the data is, where possible, exported in commonly supported or commonly known formats. So, for example, XML, JSON, it may be database dumps, so you can just use simple SQL command line tools to import and export that data. It may be possible that tools need to be prepared for legacy or proprietary data formats. Now, on the manufacturer side, on the service provider side, this is where they need to do a bit of due diligence and, in order to become ready for these data requests, to understand which parts of their product suite or their services has these proprietary formats, and what they'll need to do or put in place to make the data more digestible for the quote unquote for the end users. And then lastly, there may well be contractual provision already in place for the access of this data. So there may well be a little bit of overlap between what a manufacturer and service provider already has in place as part of their SLA. If that's the case, that's fantastic. But certainly a review of what those contractual provisions are is required, and certainly the advice that our guidance will be putting forward will be that the sooner that is done, the better. Okay, next slide, please. Then moving on to barriers to sharing. So again, we've touched on some of these, so none of these will come as any real surprise. There's obviously cost and complexity. Some data requests will be more costly and more complex than others. Some of them, the complexity will be such that it really just isn't possible to comply. But again, that is down to the manufacturer and the service provider, A, to determine, and B, to be able to evidence to the requestee and to a third party adjudicating body if it comes to that. This obviously, in terms of the barriers to sharing, look, there is quite a bit of added burden to manufacturers and service providers. The Commission is aware of that, and the authors of the Data Act were very much aware of that. Not least because there are other acts and provisions that are in the pipeline. For example, digital passport, which again are going to place even more burden on the manufacturers and service providers. Third on the list, as I mentioned before, there still is a lack of awareness. I mean, sorry, let me take a few steps back. I think there's a good level of awareness that the Data Act is in place, that it's live. But if you're to drill down to any sort of sufficient depth, I think there still is quite a bit of work to be done in raising that awareness. Obviously, seminars or webinars like today are a sort of first start at that, as is the general guidance that we'll be producing sort of around about September of this year. And then last but not least, and arguably probably the greatest barrier, is the lack of interoperability between providers. Quite possibly for good reason that we've touched on earlier on, protecting IP, protecting your commercial investment, your know-how. But the provision makes it very clear, the Act makes it very clear that cloud platforms especially must make it easier to transfer customer data from one provider to another. And this will have an impact on existing and emerging compliance as a service and software as a service providers, certainly within our sectors, security and fire sectors. Straight off the bat, because we've got quite a few. If we just sort of think of some of the major manufacturers within fire, they are moving to developing, if they are, and some of them already have, cloud-based offerings around their products and their services. So this question of interoperability and how you do that will be a bit of a challenge for some of the manufacturers, and it certainly constitutes a barrier to sharing. Obviously, the manufacturer and the service providers will have quite a bit of work to do on that front, but it is a barrier for the end user. As of today, it is still quite difficult for an end user to migrate from one compliance as a service platform to another. It's certainly possible, but it's not as seamless as the Commission or indeed the Data Act would like. I think ultimately they would like to get to a situation where it's almost as easy as transferring your mobile SIM from one carrier to the next. Now, that's a little tongue-in-cheek, because the amount of data involved there is relatively small compared to the compliance as a service software data that may be generated by even a small care home or small day operation patient out clinic. So just some of the barriers to sharing that we're all going to have to collectively work our way through. Okay, next slide, please. Then in terms of data protection, obviously, the hot topic for now and probably forevermore will be cybersecurity. How do you make all of this secure? How do you ensure that privacy is maintained? How do you ensure that you are not inadvertently leaking out or exposing vulnerabilities in your infrastructure and your data sets? So obviously that's something that's going to have to be addressed on a per manufacturer and a per service provider basis, as will be anonymization, which clearly I cannot spell. So data that is transferred to the end user, where possible, that data should be anonymized where it involves or includes information about specific members of the public. Again, the burden there is on the service provider. Individual privacy, that just a repeat. We've covered intellectual property and know-how. That forms part of data protection on the for the benefit of the service provider and manufacturer. And then obviously, as we've touched on a little earlier, the unfair, unethical, or criminal use of the shared data. We focused on some of those points earlier. Again, adding to the sort of the challenges that are inherently inbuilt into this. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of just some examples, I mean, we've walked through some examples as we've moved through the slide sets, but just again, just to sort of recap, who this may affect. As we mentioned earlier, certainly ARCs in terms of performance data, coverage, response times. It's certainly more than reasonable for an ARC client to request this information. This data will certainly be generated as part of the client's use of an ARC's infrastructure and certainly compliance as a service platforms. So perfectly reasonable for the end client to request that. Drilling down a little deeper, we can see a scenario, or as the guidance team can certainly see scenarios where residents, sort of individuals, private citizens, may request this performance data for the purposes of guaranteeing or being assured that the life safety systems and provision that has been put in place is actually working within the parameters that they would expect. So again, now you've got a chaining, if you like, of data requests. Now, in that scenario, you have to question whether a private citizen would have the ability to trawl through and analyze, large data sets. Certainly, an ARC's direct customer probably would have, but would an end client? So again, this throws up some interesting sort of challenges for the provision of data and how that data actually might be effectively used by the original requestee. Second bullet point, certainly facilities management, teams and companies. So for example, they may want to be able to request a full extract of all of their fire data over 3-4 years, for example, to begin to try and analyze patterns for, let's say, unwanted fire alarm signals. So again, they would have a service provider in place. They may well have a third party testing and maintenance provider in place, both of which feeding into that sort of rich data set, and a request coming from the facilities management team, perfectly reasonable in this scenario, would then have to be fulfilled by one or more of these service providers working in conjunction. Moving on to our friends on the security and CCTV side of things, we can certainly see examples within the use of buildings for accessing security footage. Now, stepping slightly outside of the traditional security scenario, it's not inconceivable that building designers of buildings might request security footage to look at traffic throughput, how common areas are used in order to improve the end user experience and to control traffic flow through the indoor environment. So again, that's a perfectly reasonable example of how the Data Act may be used. Another example would be accessing testing and maintenance records, again from residents or other service providers, to ensure that those activities are being carried out. And then obviously these sorts of examples fall under the remit of the various different service providers who are actively providing the data. So just a number of examples that we are looking at as a guidance team to give a little bit of real world context to the Data Act, and then the guidance that we're working on that we can share with our membership. Next slide, please. So some of the industry challenges. So some of these will be fairly obvious. We've got a bifurcated industry. I've picked on security. Well, sorry, I'm not picking on security. Security as well in advance of fire. It just is what it is. Fire is catching up, but I think it's fair to say that our friends on security and access control and CCTV side of the fence are well ahead of this. And I'm sure, and will have touched upon some of the provisions or sort of the requirements of the Data Act before the Data Act even became a thing. Certainly around requests from public bodies such as police and counterterrorism and what have you. So for the next couple of years, certainly on my side of the fence within fire, we have to continue to play catch up, and that's a big challenge. I don't think any of us would disagree with that. And just to beat the dead horse, fire remains behind in terms of real-time data gathering, the sharing, and indeed cybersecurity. So that just makes the challenge even more interesting. I should say, I'll say interesting as opposed to more difficult. But interoperability is a big challenge for both domains, and we touched upon that earlier. But certainly for fire, where you've got a number of closed protocols in place, so quite how we deal with that, I think that will come out in the wash, and I will find that of particular interest. But we do have some interoperability challenges. In terms of video processing, a huge amount of storage is required, and yes, of course, storage is getting cheaper by the day. But there's some unique challenges that come to bear within the security and CCTV domain. Maybe perhaps, I'm sure Victoria will maybe touch upon this in her section, but for example, what's the impact of AI? I don't know whether you've seen this, but over the last couple of days, as I've been looking at electronics and mathematics videos on YouTube, I have seen or I've come across adverts on YouTube for AI assisted video correction, and one young chap is presenting his product or whatever, and has deliberately not been looking directly in the camera, but with AI tools that video has been corrected. So, that example in of itself, it's not really much of an issue. It's quite interesting. But if you can use AI to do that, well, could you use AI to manipulate, doctor, and fabricate video evidence? Well, if we suspect the answer is yes, then obviously that throws up some incredibly interesting, if not concerning, questions around security and CCTV. And how that information may be used. So, we need to be thinking about these things as well. What will the impact of AI be on life safety systems? And then last but not least, there is still that sort of general lack of awareness, certainly around the unknown costs of compliance or complying with the Act, what the amount of data processing will be and what the support will be. These are all unknowns, which is really why today is the beginning of a call to arms to members to start to think about how they would respond to a request for these how to respond to these data requests and what the impact might be of complying with these requests. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this I think this is my last slide. So in terms of key dates, as I mentioned, back in January, the Act effectively became live. In September 12th, 2025, which, believe it or not, if you're getting older like me, very old, September 25 will come round very, very quickly. That's when new rules and amendments will come into force. They are actively being worked on right now, or they're being gathered right now. There will be an enforcement right across the EU. And as part of the revision to the current Data Act, there will be, or the intent is to provide model contractual terms that can be used for manufacturers and service providers to take and build upon. Between now and then, unfortunately, I think it's down to manufacturers and service providers to try and grapple with that themselves, obviously with the help of bodies like ourselves here at Euralarm. Now, in terms of the guidance that we've been talking about, jointly being developed by Euralarm and Orgalim, the task force, the joint working group, or the joint task force, is due to wrap up the heavy lifting or the main bulk of the work by end of December, and release that in the early part of 2025. What we would like to do, if we have a fair wind behind us, is start to release early drafts of that, possibly around October. I don't have a firm date for you yet, but we will keep everybody posted. But that's the intention. Obviously, we're only about halfway through our work as a joint task force, so I think releasing anything at this stage might be a little premature. But some of what we've gone through on today's slide deck with regards to the Data Act are certainly things that have come out of our work as a joint group on that to date. What we then propose to do is to have a series of follow-up webinars. Certainly a follow-up webinar, the date is to be determined, to actually walk you through that guidance, gather some feedback. Based on that feedback and how much of an appetite there is for workshops, we may set up workshops beyond that. And then when the Commission releases its amendments, its updated Data Act in September 25, there will be another webinar to walk you through what the differences and key changes are around that. So those are some of the key dates that we've got locked in. So we will keep everybody informed. Okay, so I think that brings the overview of the Data Act and the work that we've been doing in terms of the guidance around that. I'm not sure, Martin, whether you want to do questions now or whether you want to leave them to the end.
No. Currently, no. The planning was, let me put it that way, Brian, that we go now to the next presentation of Victoria, and that we have the questions at the end of the presentations. Nevertheless, if somebody has a question and is afraid of forgetting it, then there's always the chat where you can leave your question for the moment, and we'll do them at the end of the presentation. But for now, I would like to introduce Victoria, who will give you an update on the AI Act. Victoria, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Martin, and nice to meet you, all of you. I'm Victoria Ferreira. I'm representing Verisure within Euralarm, and as Martin said at the beginning of this webinar, I am since 1 month ago chair of the advocacy committee. And before I was working with Euralarm as a vice chair of the service section. So, and in fact, well, this AI app, I have been following this file since it was announced even before the first proposal. So it's like whole lifetime. And finally, we have it here. The truth is that it has many, many different angles. So I prefer to just to go through it, but very taking the presentation to the regulation itself and giving some hints on how are we implementing in our company, for example, and what we deem is more relevant. So if you can move to the next slide. Thank you. So first of all, I would like to give you an update, or where are we right now? If you go to the next slide. As you know, this regulation is a regulation, therefore it from Europe, so it requires the agreement between European Parliament and the Council coming from the European Commission proposal. What we are expecting right now we have already the agreement in European from the Parliament and from the Council. And then what we are expecting now is the pure publication in the official journal, which will be the beginning of the timelines of the timelines to know when the regulation will be will come into force. So as I know from a meeting that I have this morning with some people from the Commission, it seems that next the publication in the official journal will take place next 12th of July. That is what they expect. So from then on, in 24 minutes, month, the regulation will come in forth. And in the case of some outright bans that are foreseen by the regulation, that will be in 6 months from 12th July, therefore 12th January. What is also new is that the AI office has been already established in Brussels. We have Lucila Scioli, who is the one who has been appointed as chair of the AI office, which is the European entity, will be in charge of ensure that the AI Act is coherently applied through the member states, and also is in charge of investigating potential infringements, also drawing the state of the art codes of practice to detail out the rules in cooperation with developers and the scientific community. Also, the AI office will be preparing guidelines and guidance, implementing and the delegating acts and other tools to support effective implementation of the AI Act. In that sense, if you see in the slides, it is divided in different, let's say, domains. You have the connected AI for artificial intelligence, robotic, thermal compliance, safety, artificial intelligence innovation and policy coordination, artificial intelligence for societal goods, and within one of these each of these departments will act as a head of unit. Depending from this AI office, each country has to nominate their own national authority, which will be the one in charge of implementing the regulation in each country, and to nominate who are going to be the stakeholders acting as a authorization body. So far we have that just Spain and Denmark has appointed the national authority, but well, once it's announced in the official journal, the publication of the regulation, I guess the rest will be almost there. If you can move to the next one. So what we have also is the other initiative that is right now on the table, starting from the Commission, is that the Commission announced at the beginning of this year, once the agreement was reached in December, the Commission decided to announce that they wanted to launch the so-called AI Pact. AI Pact is a kind of bridge the regulation from the moment it is approved until it comes to reality, and it is until the moment it is enforced. So the main objectives, it is an open call for all the business, all the industries, and also even public stakeholders. And the aim is to establish a framework for information exchange among the relevant stakeholders, like to promote best practice. Also, they are trying to identify front runners. So they make some recommendations to the companies that are still analyzing how to implement these changes. They want to encourage early adoption of regulation. As I was saying, they want to encourage front runners. And they also want to create an advisory body. That would be maybe a good idea for associations that will advise on permanent basis afterwards the AI office, for example. There has been already a first meeting introducing this AI Pact. The main goal, the main objectives of that meeting was to provide an overview of the AI Act and also of what they wanted to reach with the AI Pact. Also, there was a discussion on which is the state of state of the play of standard development by Sense and Elect, which is quite relevant, and it will be the development of some of the requirements stated by the regulation. And as next steps, they announced 2 workshops to be held in June and July, but so far they have not been held, at least the June one. And there will be another AI Pact session for late 2024. Within Euralarm, we have decided to join this AI Pact as a way to be really close to the European Commission in case we have doubts or we need to meet them to analyze a given part of the regulation, and also because it's the best way to be aware of all the developments that are being worked so far. If you take the AI regulation, you see that there are almost 30 guidelines, recommendations, delegated acts pending to be developed. So it's really important to be aware of all this procedure. If you can move to the next one. So here is the timeline of the milestones we have right now. As I told you, it started 2 years ago, 2022. It's going to be published 12th July 2024, but the works regarding the development of the standards related to this regulation has already started, and they are awaited by mid-2025, but we don't know if we will reach that time. And the coming to force is expected by 2026. Can you move to the next one? And then going directly to the AI Act, I know most of you probably know it quite well. I wanted just to give small hints of hints of information about it. The scope is more or less completely based on what we have right now in the Blue Guide, for example. They divide between providers, users/developers, importers, distributors are the and requirements for each of these agents, and how the manufacturers coming from sample from outside EU have to regulate their products and services within this framework with the figure of the authorized representative of the provider. And then as a summary, what you know is, well, this is the world's first comprehensive legal framework for artificial intelligence. And not to go too far, they have just remained more at technical levels, but it's true that some activities have been directly banned. So what we mentioned before as outright bannings, which will come in force 6 months after the publication of the regulation. For example, social scoring. Other activities will be permitted, but with broad obligation. Those will be the system called nominated as high risk. I will explain you afterward which are those. And then we have 2 more categories like medium and low risk. For low risk, there is almost nothing, and for what they call medium risk, the obligations are more on transparency, providing to the users transparency on what is the service about, what is the product about. The penalties, there was, of course, there is no regulatory regime without penalties. They're completely based on the competition ones, as they are as they're calculated with an amount for the highest threshold is 40 million or 7% of the entire group total annual worldwide turnover. I mean, for all the revenues the company might have around the world. So if you can move to the next one. The definition. Well, I wanted to stop in the definition because there has been a lot of discussions, and finally, this is well different from the one that was in the first European Commission proposal, which was very broad. This is also quite broad, but at least it's closer to the one that the OCDE has promoted. And in this sense, which is important, is what is relevant from this definition. For example, if we read it, we see a machine-based system designed to operate with varying level of autonomy, that is to say, from nothing to high level of autonomy, and that my extremely adaptiveness after deployment, that is, has their own life after it has been put in place for explicit or implicit objective, that is to say, for any type of objective, that infers from the input, and the input may be anything, data, set rules, and algorithm defined by the developer, training data used by the developers, additional instruction provided by the developers, and so on, in order to generate outputs, such as, and this is what is really relevant, predictions, content, recommendations, or decisions. So it's not that we can say, no, this is this AI system is not high risk or it's not relevant because it's just providing a recommendation, and it will be more relevant if it provides a decision. Okay, in any case, it's an AI system that falls within the scope of this regulation. If you can move to the next slide. And in this case, what we have is how the pyramid that they have set, how the AI systems are classified, and this will be the core criteria of the regulation. So for those systems that are considered to have unacceptable risk, they are directly banned. Here we have the right. I don't know if you can read the letters, but we will provide you the presentation. And between these activities, the most known one maybe is the social scoring, like in this film of Black Mirror, where they were, excuse me, sorry, where you get the score because of social capacity. So this is completely banned. And for our purpose, in the case of the private security, for example, what was really important was that here they were including the real-time biometric identification in public spaces for the purpose of law enforcement. So at the very beginning, when we wrote this, we say, okay, we are not going to be able to cooperate with police anymore if they cannot carry out this type of activities. And in fact, if they cannot carry out this type of activities, maybe we have a national security problem, because that means that you couldn't not even, for example, in the case of a kid being kidnapped, the kid was not, it was not going to be possible to identify him in the crowd. So at the end, the industry and the countries itself managed to include these exemptions that are called here a narrow exemption applied. That is to say that if a judge orders, so that will be these systems will be possible to be used. I mean, it will be possible to use this system by the police. In addition, during the discussion of the regulation, another thing that we came across that biometric is that identification is one thing and verification is another thing. So what we made was to meet parliamentarians and meet the Commission and also the Council in order to make sure that verification activities were completely out of the scope of this regulation. And with this, what we were granting is that verification activities will not be considered as an acceptable risk and neither high risk. With verification activities, I'm referring, for example, to the camera that you install at your house, recognizing that is your kid, the one who is knocking the door, because you have prior said to the camera, to the system, that kid is your kid. Or, for example, with a mobile phone, when you open your Apple, like this, that's recognizing your face. Those activities are verification and therefore no identification, but it has to be included in the regulation, because if not, all was considered kind of identification. I think this is quite relevant for our sector. In addition, we have the high-risk activities. High-risk activities can be, you see here, a first list, but in general terms can be classified in two groups. First one will be the standalone AI systems, which pose a high risk of harm to the health and safety or fundamental rights of the persons. And which systems are those? Well, the European Commission the regulation in one of the annex, I don't remember if it's Annex 2 or Annex 3 right now, list of domains that are considered as high, that can pose a high risk for certain aspects. This list can be updated by the European Commission, I think is each 6 months or 9 months. So still is a little bit not too certain, but well, it's like the first filter we have to do. Typical activities included right now, the one you see there: recruitment, staff monitoring, remote biometric identification, access to essential private services, critical infrastructure operation or management, and so on. And then also as an activity under the scope of high risk, we have those AI systems which are safety components of products or products themselves, falling within the scope of one of the 19 specified piece of EU harmonized legislation. Mainly those systems that are considered that have kind of standardization due to the potential as safety components. And after that, as I mentioned, we have the limited or no risk AI system, which are more virtual assistant, chatbots, spam filters. And in those cases, you have just to inform, provide transparency or assume transparency implications. If we move to the next slide, I wanted to give you a view of who are the agents that are impacted by the regulation. Of course, providers, because the providers are the one defining, developing the AI system or itself, but also deployers. Deployers, and at the very beginning, they didn't have such a big bunch of requirements as the one they have at the end, but during the procedure, the legislative procedure, it was seen that they really had also a very highest position on how the AI system was used by the final user. Therefore, at the end, they have to assume also, they have to assume a higher level of requirement in regards to what was foreseen at the very beginning, even to carry out a fundamental rights assessment report analysis for each of the AI systems they are using. What is important is that each time that a deployer can become a provider if they carry out a substantial modification of one AI system. So this is important to take into account and to know when you are assessing which AI systems do you have at your organization and which role do you have in regards of them. Then we have importers. In this sense, the role of the importer is really similar to what we have right now in the sense of the declarations of conformity. You, as an importer, are in charge of making sure that the product service that you are importing is compliance with this regulation. And again, distributors has an alike role, but just with less requirements. Of course, you as an organization can be provider because of one system, importer because of the other one. So it's kind of a big mix. Can you move to the next one? And yes, well, this is to make it's a short list of requirements. So this is just the most relevant one. As I was saying, unacceptable risk, no requirements, as they are directly prohibited, they are directly banned. In the case of high risk, for the providers, conformity assessment against the regulation before putting it in the market, registration in the new EU database, which is going to be controlled by each national agency and, of course, the AI office. And then key requirements that have to be proved on data quality and governance, transparency, accuracy, robustness, cybersecurity, human oversight, risk and quality, technical documentation, record keeping. Those are the requirements that are vaguely defined in the regulation, more or less defined, but of course needs full development by industry standards. And this is what Centrelink is doing right now within the GTC 21. And this is why there is a lot of expectation on how, which are going to be the final outcomes, because there is no really a clear definition on, for example, what is transparency in the regulation itself to be able to implement it. So if you go through it, you say, okay, fine, provide transparency to the users. How? So what letter, how many means? It really needs industry standard support. Also, post-market monitoring system and incident reporting also established for providers, and in the case of the deployers, also a big list of requirements, fundamental rights impact assessment, comply with provider instructions, using technical organization measures, assign human oversight to competent training and support personnel, also ensure relevant and representative input data, and fulfill monitoring, record keeping, and incident reporting obligations. In this sense, this is something very similar to what is established already for the GDPR in case of breach of security, and what it will come for cybersecurity with the Cyber Resilient Act. So, more or less, we are ready to be used to this type of activities. And then for limit or no risk, that is this, for example, in ChatGPT will be one of these. Transparency obligation if interacting externally, and adoption of approved conduct are encouraged. Encouraged is not mandatory, but it would be nice if you have them. If you can move to the next one, these are what I was mentioned before about the standards being developed by GTC 21 on all these domains. As I said, there has been already, if I'm not wrong, like 2-3 meetings, and there is kind of concern by the European Commission that the works are not going so fast as they wanted, maybe because they have not given so much time. Maybe we need some more time to develop the standard for each of these domain. Let's see here. I think is where the focus on the industry should be right now. And I see that we are running out of time, so I would like to go quick to what we are doing internally, just to give you a flavor of how we are handling the implementation of the regulation. Very short, for example. Martin, if you can move to the next one. For us, as next steps, the first thing we have done is to identify all the AI system that our organization is using or developing. I mean, is using as a deployer or developing as a producer. And in this case, what I advise is always that you need to go to each and every area and in each and every country. We are in Europe, we are in 13 different countries. And I can assure you that you always find something new. So maybe you have them it's something that they have developed just for human resources, which is an area that you normally won't be expected to develop their own IT systems. Suddenly they are. So it's really a hard work. So we have been working on this one since months already. And I really encourage you to go area by area. And also, we have to take into account that probably we are not producers of AI systems that can be classified as high risk, or maybe just one or two. But for sure, we are developers. If I say Workday, all people knows Workday, most of you will have it as a human resources tool. Then in those cases, we are developers, not deployers. So the other important thing is to go to procurement and ask them to have a list of exactly all the providers with whom we are working, and to send them a letter asking them, okay, guys, are you providing me kind of AI system that is considered as high risk? If so, which are your recommendations? Because the best thing is to follow what the producer is going to tell you. And after that, as I say, once we have the list, we have to clarify in the organization which role we are taking in regards of AI system. And for example, it might happen that we have bought from, I don't know, imagine again, Workday, one product, but we have really changed it. We have really integrated it in our human resources department, and now we are making a scoring of employees that Workday was not providing as a service. So maybe we have become a producer in that sense. This is something that we have to take into account, and we have to monitor how we're going to act in that sense. Beside, we have the list. Of course, we have to determine whether the AI systems are in the scope of the AI Act, because some of them will not be in the scope. in concretely, if the AI system is placed in the market but used exclusively for military or defense or national security purposes, these systems are outside the scope. And also, if the system is solely, if the system has been developed or put into service solely for scientific research and development, is also outside the scope of this regulation. And of course, this regulation also apply to those systems that have been produced outside the EU, but have been put in place, put in the market in the EU. Again, well, the next steps are classify the AI system and general purpose AI models. General purpose AI models is a type of AI system that has capability to behave as different AI systems, let's to say, and has the capability to integrate different AI systems in once. That would be an example, would be the Open Chat, I don't remember the name, Open Chat 4. That is like the way the ChatGPT has been developed. I don't remember how it's here. Here is the Open AI GPT-A, who is the user-facing system from ChatGPT that belongs a third-party app build different features on ChatGPT. For example, this will be an example of this general-purpose AI, which is more unusual. At least we don't have any of them. Then once we have identified all the systems, then we have with the governance, including the requirements and implementing the requirements that are established in the way we are managing them, both as producer and both as deployers. For example, in the case of deployers, it seems easier, but it's not, because you have to train all the people that is interacting with those systems. So it's something that impacts really the whole organization. Therefore, what you need is to put a good and robust AI governance framework. I brought an example, which is in the next slide. It's a bit complex, but it's the one we have started using in our organization to define who are the areas that might be impact. And we see, well, the attributes of the trustworthy AI is something like to follow and to take into account in the governance we are setting. First, we have to set the governance structure, who is going to be the AI officer, who is going to, how he's going to be in charge of control the different areas. The risk management framework, where we are how exposed at our AI systems, scoping, metering, classification. This is what I was just mentioning, an operational process of governance and control, how we are going to operate from now on, because this is something that has come to stay and we have to get used to it. It's very similar to what we had when we had the GDPR. It was kind of a whole transformation of the industry in the sense and of the internal process. So in this case, we have to bear something similar to that. And this is all on my side. And I hope it can be of help.
Okay, thank you, Victoria. I know that you are on a tight schedule and need to jump to a next meeting. So I would propose that if there are any questions for Victoria, we do them first. I haven't seen somebody raise his hand. And otherwise, Victoria, I would like to thank you very much for your contribution so far. And I'll do the questions that were sent to me with Brian. That would be my suggestion. The first, Brian, is on compliance and impact. Question. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I need to leave, but any question you just send it to me and I will answer all of them. But
okay, no, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Brian, if you're still with us, how does the EU Data Act impact data management practices within the electronic fire safety and security industry is the question. And what measures are companies taking to ensure compliance? Two questions, I think. Could you answer that? Brian, are you still with us?
Yes, still here. Sorry, Martin, trying to yes, wrestling with Teams. So sorry, I was trying to get Teams off mute. So could you just run through the question for me one more time, please?
Yeah, sorry for that. The question was on compliance and impact. How does the EU Data Act impact data management practices within the electronic fire safety and security industry? And what measures are company taken to ensure compliance?
Yeah, okay. So two parts to that question. So
Yeah.
okay. So let's deal with the impact. Okay, so this really is in essence all about data sharing first and foremost, and as I sort of mentioned before, the intent of the Commission is to encourage data sharing to drive innovation, but also primarily for innovation, but also to ensure that data can easily be accessed by if you like, the data subject. So if you like, there's a two-tier approach to this. So in terms of the data there's data that's produced by services and products through their use. So if we take the example then of, say, fire alarm systems, we can see in the fire alarm system space that there's increasingly a move towards collection of the data from fire alarm systems or fire security systems and services, not just fire alarm systems. Bringing that back to a central point, analyzing that data and making the management and that data analysis and reporting available to the end client. So a specific example there, I think I touched on it earlier, would be you've got a hospital with a number of buildings. Each building has a fire alarm system and various other life safety systems connected together. All of that data is being pooled to a single point. For the purposes of this discussion, we'll simply assume that it's a cloud-based compliance as a service platform, and provided by, let's just say, Amazon, because Amazon are taking over the world. That's a little tongue in cheek. So, but that might age like milk, unfortunately. But so we'll just use Amazon as an example. Okay, so in this instance, Amazon are providing the service. They're possibly providing some or all of the infrastructure, and the hospital is the end user. Now, all of the data that's being generated during the hospital's daily and nightly use, 24/7, 365 days a year. All of that data that's being generated and fed back through to Amazon is, strictly speaking, being generated as part and parcel of the hospital's day-to-day running. Now, some of that data, well, specifically the life-critical data around fire alarms going off, emergency lighting being tested, those sorts of things. I guess for the purpose of this example, there's no real end user privacy issues. I mean, I'm talking about a member of public. So we'll set that to one side just for now. So it's more than reasonable for the management team of that hospital to request from Amazon a regular extract of the data that's being collected, the raw data, because they would like to analyze that themselves. Perhaps they've got a capable in-house team who will do that in their engineering department. Perhaps they're partnering with a local university to help them jointly develop some specialist procedures, algorithms, and know-how that will allow them to get on top of or gain greater insights into unwanted fire alarm signals, or maybe they would like to, try and understand which of their detection systems and devices are more performant than others. So there's a wide range of really interesting questions you can ask, but you can't do much beyond that if you don't have the data. So it's a very reasonable sort of request that you could see being made by the hospital. Now, in terms of, in this example, Amazon, when they receive that request, in order to comply with it, they need to be in a position where they can basically transfer that data to the hospital in a manner in which, or in a format that staff from the hospital can easily do something with. Now, there is a little bit of devil in the detail there. So in an ideal world, as a service provider, Amazon would have all of that data sitting in, let's just say, nicely formatted XML with well-defined document type definitions, which is a way of describing how the XML is formatted, and what you can expect to find when you're parsing and traversing that XML. And they've also got really excellent documentation and examples and tools that can be downloaded that can let anybody from that hospital take the data and start to do something meaningful with it. Now, that's all in an ideal world. Now, in that ideal world, say, for example, transpose that. If you're representing, as a member, you're representing a manufacturer or a service provider, that's really a situation, or that's a position that you would like to be in, where one of your clients who's buying infrastructure and services from you can come to you at any point and say, I would like all of my data, or I would like data for one specific hospital. I would like to have it within 2 or 3 weeks, thank you very much. And I would like to have it in an XML or JSON data format. In an ideal world, as a manufacturer of fire alarm systems and software, cloud software that goes hand in hand with that, you would like to be able to say, well, that's all part and parcel of the Data Act. We comply. We don't do everything because that just would not be practical. But here's what we do. You can have your data up to 1 year ago. It's all in XML format. Here's the documentation to get you started. We provide that as standard. If you want anything beyond that, okay, there are limits to what we can do. But if we've got to do additional processing and provide additional support over and above that, here is our bill of rates, based on man hours or whatever it is. So if you don't, and look, I'm going to make a fairly sort of sweeping statement here. I'm going to assume that the vast majority of our membership isn't in a position to respond in that way today, because let's face it, the Data Act has really only been ratified and released officially at the start of this year. We're all very busy. There's lots of legislation that has come out in the past handful of years, and we're all playing catch up. There's only so many hours in the day. So really, the work that we're doing in terms of building the guidance between ourselves, Euralarm, and Orgalim is to help our member organizations fairly quickly get to a position where they understand what they're prepared to provide. Now, part of that will be, okay, what is very clearly our intellectual property, our competitive edge know-how, so all of that's off limits. So once that is identified, and that should be fairly quick to do, then comes the discussion internally amongst yourselves around, okay, what can we provide easily? How does that look? What's the data format? How far back in time can we go? Can we really do that for free? Or do we need to charge a nominal amount? And then what are we prepared to do, if anything, above and beyond that, where there will be a cost for engineer time, support time, etc. So, because what the Commission can't do, and what the Data Act certainly doesn't in any way attempt to do, is to say you must by law make all data available since you started collecting it to everybody. Okay, so there's boundaries around this, and it's certainly up to the manufacturers and service providers to stipulate what their boundaries are. So you certainly, within fire alarm systems, fire safety systems, there are going to be limits to what you can provide. If you're not already collecting it, it's not reasonable for an end user to demand that you start to retrospectively try and sort of computate that based off data that you have collected. It just may not be possible. It's not reasonable for a data requester to then basically say, okay, well then you have to start collecting this data, because it just may not be within the provision of the service that you provide. But where you are collecting that data, and where you both agree that it is of interest to the requestee, and they are a direct client or indirect client, then certainly you have an obligation to consider the request, and then where practicable to fulfill the request and comply. And as I've said before during my part of the presentation, and I have to say Victoria's I thought was absolutely fantastic. As manufacturers and service providers, we are allowed to say, well, actually, no, we don't think this is in the best interests of the client, because some of this information should not get into the wider the wider public, over and above data that may be commercially sensitive to us. But anyway, in a very sort of rambling way, what I'm getting to is that there's an exercise required by each manufacturer and service provider, and I think the sooner that we kickstart, as individual organizations, members, the sooner that we do this, the better. And what I would say, and I've said this in other webinars, we've got a golden opportunity here as a connected membership to reach out to each other for support, advice, and also stripping away the commercially sensitive stuff, is to say, okay, well, look, here's some of the challenges we faced as an organization. Here's how we got around them. This may be of interest to some other members. Now, this is certainly where, as Euralarm, we'd be very happy to facilitate that. But this is a very, over the next sort of handful of weeks and months, as we all sort of get to grips with this, there's a really fantastic opportunity to do a lot of knowledge sharing around this, and hopefully both parts of today's webinars hopefully will act as a bit of a call to arms or call to action for that. Now, the second part of that, can
you keep it short, because we are running out of time.
Sorry, and the second part was
what measures companies could take to ensure compliance. Otherwise, perhaps we could leave that part out, Brian, and try to answer that questions when it comes, and make them available via our website, for instance.
Yes, very happy to do that. Yes, and we'll make available my email address. For that as well. Very happy to.
Okay, let's do it that way. With that, our webinar comes to an end. As you may have noticed, the Euralarm webinars are recorded to enable colleagues to view the recordings at a later date. This one will be on our website as of tomorrow, so please feel free to share the information with your colleagues. And with that, I wish you a very pleasant evening, a very pleasant rest of the week. For those who will be watching football later this evening, all the best for whatever country you support. And we hope to see you during one of our upcoming webinars. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody. Ciao.